And welcome back to Platonic Soul. I hope you've been well. So this episode, I'll be putting forth an idea about Plato's philosophy that, to my knowledge, has never been advanced before. I suppose probably because it crosses over a bit from philosophy as we understand it today to psychology as we understand it today. And that idea is that this teaching we have from Plato, and we have more explicitly from the Neoplatonic tradition about the psyche's ecstatic union with reality, or you could say the principle of reality, the one, the soul's vision, if you like, of the one, in some way brings into play the unconscious, or if you like, buried memory of our very early pre-rational lives that we all must have. You might remember that I've been talking recently about this idea raised by Freud that unitive or oceanic experiences, as he put it, borrowing a term from his friend, might be a memory of our very earliest childhood, our infancy, or I might interpolate even our prenatal lives, before our ego split itself off from the world and from itself by starting to think, by making everything, including itself, an object for itself, an object for its thinking. Now, we saw last time how Plato's myth of souls fallen from a state of bliss in heaven, unconsciously longing to regain that state, can't be reduced simply to this, if you like, Freudian interpretation, because Plato does not describe souls in that state as lacking anything, including the capacity to reason. It's clear from the myth he's not talking simply about an unconscious desire to return to an infantile state. And I think we could add other reasons why this interpretation of Plato would be kind of unattractive. To see our deepest desire as simply for a return to the earliest stage of our development seems pretty un-Platonic, not to mention depressing. It seems to not recognize that the glory and freedom of thinking, the ability to seize the truth, are part of who we are as humans, and these are things Plato would have considered divine gifts that we would not want to give up. Rather, like animals, I think, pre-rational humans have no real freedom, or perhaps they do and they don't. They have the freedom to follow their own instincts, which, of course, is in a way is a kind of freedom we all aspire to. But this is also kind of bondage, of course, because it's all they can do. Anyway, it's also hard to imagine how giving up thinking would even be possible, how we could simply stop thinking. Thinking clearly seems part of who we are and of what we want to realize about ourselves. So it was fine to pass up a reduction of Plato's myth to a mere Freudian interpretation, but the only problem with a wholesale rejection of it was that it seemed to bring us back to this place we were when we first encountered the myth. That is to say, we couldn't help but remain struck by the startling similarities we saw in this myth and in the natural evolution of human consciousness, what Hegel called this self-sundering process in which the mind, by thinking, alienates itself from the world, including itself. And also, we felt the desire to, in a way, mine this myth. We sensed the presence of a richness in it, but one that remained kind of locked up because it remained expressed in the form of images rather than ideas. So then we find ourselves facing the question, if the myth must be seen as something more than a story of longing for neonatal or prenatal existence, if it can't be simply reduced to that, can some light still perhaps be shed on it from that vantage point? In other words, is there a baby in the Freudian bathwater, and the pun is intended here, that we risk throwing out? As I said last time, I kind of think there is. I think there's a way we can open up this myth using Freud's insight in a way that doesn't do damage to it. In fact, in my opinion at least, in a way that brings the myth to fuller light and life. And here are my thoughts about that. We talked last time about the role rationality through philosophy plays in our building an objective account of reality. For Plato, as we saw, this culminates in the conclusion that the absolute good or absolute unity is the principle of everything. So thinking, it seems, has some power to heal the rift it caused, to overcome the alienation it has set in motion by showing how otherness, in a way, isn't the last word. And this is what Hegel concludes also in the same passage of his Logic that we cited earlier. And I think I'll cite that passage more fully now. He writes, in its instinctive and natural stage, spiritual, or mental actually, the German word Geist, as you may know, means both mind and spirit. So in its instinctive and natural stage, spiritual or mental life wears the garb of innocence and confiding simplicity. This is the life of the child. But the very essence of spirit implies, or mind, implies the absorption of this immediate condition in something higher. The spiritual or mental is distinguished from the natural, and more especially from the animal life, in the circumstance that it does not continue a mere stream of tendency, but sunders itself to self-realization. And I find it's just kind of an amazing phrase that sort of in some ways comes across as paradoxical, but I think the deeper one gets into Hegel, the more it makes sense. The human mind sunders itself to self-realization. But this position of severed life has in its turn to be suppressed, and the spirit has by its own act, or mind, to win its way to concord again. The final concord then is spiritual or mental. That is, the principle of restoration to oneness, he means, is found in thought, and thought only. The hand that inflicts the wound is also the hand that heals it. And a little later he says, the harmoniousness of childhood is a gift from the hand of nature. The second harmony must spring from the labor and culture of the spirit or mind. I'm not really sure exactly what to think of Hegel here. I think it's fine for thinking to reach this point at which it concludes that unity must be the principle of everything. But as long as this is a mere rational process, and as we know, that's what the Platonic quest is, as long as this is a merely rational process, it's going to be moving within the realm of abstraction. And abstraction is always going to involve objectification in some way. It's the creation of an object of thought. And so abstraction, or objectivity, if you like, alone seems like it's never really capable of getting us to the absolute unity that it itself is pointing us to. It's always going to involve that othering, that alienating or self-sundering process. I think another way of saying basically the same thing is that as long as we're making use of abstractions, the one, or the unity of reality, is going to involve some kind of image making. It's probably impossible to think about it without, on some level, imagining some sort of quasi-container in which things are kind of quasi-placed. So in other words, without imagining it as some kind of object. But if we want to in some way approach the absolute unity of absolutely everything that must be the principle we're seeking, it must be beyond the subject-object divide. Our cognition of it must somehow be immediate. It must transcend the division of subject and object. And in the marvelous concluding tractate of his Enneads, Plotinus makes a similar argument. I mean that the oneness we seek must in some way transcend subject and object as two separate things, or if you like, take up the subjective and objective into a real yet unimaginable unity. Except he comes at it from the other side. He comes at it from the subjective side. He asks whether our search is merely for our own center, the ground, if you like, of subjectivity alone. He writes, is it then the center of the soul, in a way, that we are looking for? But then suddenly questions whether this is really enough. Or should one realize, he asks, that there is something else, like a center in which all centers, in a way, coincide? And a little later he answers himself. The center or principle we seek, the one, is the principle at once of our subjective or inner lives and our lives in all our individuality or particularity, and also in some way of the objective world, the universal world, the cosmos. He writes, when we actually raise ourselves up by the part not plunged in the body, that's to say, when we are somehow able to cogitate without imagining or objectifying, we fix ourselves using our center to the center of all things, in a way, like fixing the centers of the greatest circles to the containing sphere. And there we come to rest. So our desire is not simply to have some kind of objective knowledge that unity is the center or principle of everything, but actually to fix ourselves to this principle, to actually in some way live this principle, this unity. And for us to not just think about the principle, but to be one with it, we need some kind of immediate cognition of it. This purely objective and objectifying account of reality that we build of abstractions isn't enough. It points beyond itself. To be fully realized, it needs to somehow also bring subjective unity, this experience of oneness, ecstasy, or the unitive experience, subjective glimpses of what absolute unity must be something like. I mean, it needs the truth of the one and the immediacy of the other to overcome their division. It needs some kind of content, and this may sound kind of contradictory in our age, some kind of content that actually is not articulate. Not knowledge as we conventionally understand it, but you could say lived experience of that principle of unity, lived experience that has never been tainted with disunity because it has never been articulated. So unconscious content, in a way, unconscious knowledge. And it's hard to know what that would be if not a buried or unconscious memory of a life of pure existential unity, the kind we lived in the very early stages of our lives. A memory that is buried or unconscious because we did not have the cognitive resources at the time to shape it into the kind of ordinary memory that we can recollect by an effort of will, that we can haul before the mind's eye like any other object of thought. It seems plausible to me both that our earliest life would be, much as Freud describes it, profoundly unitive in this way, oceanic, and also that this content has not simply been erased like a kind of deleted computer file, but that some sort of cognitive residue of it must remain in our minds somehow, a buried memory of a former state that is perhaps triggered by our encounters with beauty or oneness in our current lives, similar indeed to those of the fallen and embodied Platonic soul that Socrates describes in the Phaedrus. So those are my thoughts about that. Just one thing I want to make clear, though, is to recognize exactly where we would be going wrong if we saw this existential unity that the Platonic philosophy, Platonic love, sees as the goal of our lives, if we saw it purely as relivings of an earlier state, because that's not what I'm arguing here. We have these sayings, you can never go home again, or you can never step into the same river twice, that I think are actually kind of helpful here, even though they might seem like cliches. The fact that we are in some way or on some level revisiting these pre-rational states, or they are revisiting us, when we are now rational, actually makes all the difference, I think. When we understand these states now, we can see them as windows into the absolute, windows into the first principle of everything, windows into truth. We have, if you like, reached a higher unity than was possible the first time around through something like that process Hegel described. Because now we have both unity and the freedom and power of thought, if you like, the glory and responsibility of truth. And so these memories, if you like, coming to our consciousness, because they come to consciousness, are not the same as they were the first time around. We found a way to not have to give up one to have the other, truth and unity, I mean. And that is possible, that this is possible, at least, is the great Platonic hope in my mind. And one point Plato repeatedly makes in his writings is that it's a task of philosophy not just to convince the mind, but to turn the whole person around. And put another way, philosophy for Plato needs to incorporate real life to be complete, or particularity, you could say. Not just the universal, but the particular. It must engage the whole person, the individual, qua individual. It must actually span, or if you will, take up or engage both the conscious and the unconscious. And I think this is really our answer to Bertrand Russell and Rebecca Goldstein, who, as we mentioned a few episodes ago, saw the rational on one hand and the ecstatic or intuitive, or the rational and the unitive, if you could say, at odds with each other in Plato. And in my view, well, in my humble opinion, thereby sort of missed the whole point of Plato. In fact, properly understood, I think each completes the other in the vision of the one. Each aids the other in the psyche's journey of self-reintegration. And I think this theme will continue to develop in what's left of this video series. As for Hegel, his understanding of reason in a way goes deeper than the conventional understanding, I think, and perhaps there's some way to reconcile Hegel and Plato, or at least my understanding of Plato, because Hegel clearly sees reason. He differentiates between reason, Vernunft, and what's translated as understanding, Verstand. And it's clearly his belief that reason is somehow unitive or unifying. Anyway, that I think will have to be a topic for another day. So anyway, that is my theory of how we might in some way, if you like, integrate Freud into Platonism, not just as a kind of intellectual exercise, but actually I think to help us bring Plato's myth and his whole teaching on the soul, teaching on love and desire, how to make it come fully alive. But you might also have noticed it leaves us with a problem, or an apparent problem anyway. In our interpretation, we have the psyche engaging some sort of buried memory in its quest, but nevertheless proceeding beyond that first unity to a higher one. If this is true and we're always finding the new, in a way, are we being unfaithful to Plato's myth, which is clearly about the return of the psyche to its original state? I think we can actually solve this problem, and that's what I'll be looking at next time. Hope to see you then, and until then, thanks again for watching.